disconcerting to not be able to see your faces. So therefore, know that I'm not seeing you. So bop in, so my lovely hosts unmute and bop in. And I appreciate so much that you will keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A for me. So thank you. Thank you for having me. As Jess said, I'm Anita Raymond, and I am the Program Director at the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision Making at Volunteers of America, Minnesota. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about these issues with you, whether as parents, as professionals. We know this transition age is a pretty big deal, and for reasons I will go into, we know that that parents often are encouraged strongly as sort of a de facto to seek guardianship. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about both the benefits and the downsides of that approach, and then introduce or reintroduce for some of you the concept of supported decision making. I just realized as we were doing the introductions that I didn't bring any sort of where are we kind of poll or chat questions, but I just do want to acknowledge that people in the virtual room and people who watch the recording certainly are at different places in understanding, having been exposed to supported decision making. Some people might feel like it's a brand new topic. Some people feel like they have some familiarity. Some people feel like maybe they could be giving this presentation. And so I hope there's a little something for everyone in this, and trying to cover that broad scope of where people may be in their understanding of it all. So when we think about what happens as young people turn 18, what we know, this is a point of transition. This is a point that lots of families and kids very much look forward to. They get excited. We think about, I'm going to be an adult when I'm 18. Some parents see that, parents of kids with or without disabilities, see that age approaching with some worry, some excitement, some, oh my goodness, my kid, again, with or without a disability, my kid isn't near ready to be out on their own and to be considered an adult. I'll never consider them an adult. We know from our own selves and from our kids, again, with or without disabilities, they often come back. I need more help. I made a big mistake. But what happens with kids with disabilities is things get a little different. There's definitely been pressures placed historically on families, whether it's in the conversations that must happen with the IDEA Act, but the way the conversations happen, just in the phrases that are used, the language that state policy hands down to special ed professionals. Sometimes it's an implied, you must get guardianship, or sometimes it's not so implied, but really, really pushed very hard. Other parents who've been through this. I've heard some parents call getting guardianship for their 18-year-old children who have disabilities as a rite of passage. Personally, that hurts me a lot to hear that some people might consider it a rite of passage, because quite frankly, it is anything but. We think of rites of passage as being a very positive thing and a new stage in a person's life. Usually we're thinking about that phrase with regard to a new stage of accomplishment in a person's life. But as we'll talk about, what actually happens with guardianship is indeed, while we're building in some protections, we're also taking away a lot from the person. So if nothing else, I hope we can get away from anybody who might be carrying that idea as it's just a given, because I hear other people say it. I hear professionals tell me I need to get it. I'm worried about the safety and vulnerability of my kid who's turning into a young adult. So there's just lots and lots of implied and actual pressures on parents. And really, to further set this stage, I want to call your attention to this 2019 report published by the National Council on Disability. You can find it online. I believe I have it in a link at the end of my presentation. But it calls out this very issue. It references the fact that historically, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been really directed into guardianship as a de facto practice. In fact, the research shows, again, with good intentions, that it's almost thought of, and it's quoted in the report, as a school to guardianship pipeline, which is a pretty serious approach, a pretty serious way to contemplate that. And again, even subtly, without even realizing. In fact, I've talked to a lot of special education professionals who feel like I'm not the one directing guardianship, it's the county case managers, or it's the doctor, or it's others. People don't feel biased towards using guardianship, and I completely believe them. I absolutely do. But again, sometimes it's just the conversation or the way the forms are written that you have to that special education professionals have to introduce this topic, and the check the box, we had this conversation, even that can be an implied you must seek guardianship. And the national study, when they considered all 18 to 22-year-olds in the category of people that were receiving waivered services, 58% of those young people were under guardianship. And again, we can certainly agree lots of people do need guardianship, but I would wager 58% of them is probably a bit higher than the actual need. When we break it down to on the Minnesota level, now this isn't just limited to people who are on waiver. This is in Minnesota, all people who are under guardianship, all adults who are under guardianship, 26,000 and some change. When you look at this breakdown in this slide, it's pretty significant that 84% of the people subject to guardianship in Minnesota are people who are not older adults. And further, a full 34% of the representative population of people under guardianship are in that youngest category of that 18 to 29 category. So it's pretty significant use. And times are really changing. And that's why I'm so excited to be here today. We now know that guardianship is not necessary in as many situations as we would have previously thought. We also know that guardianship is harmful to people and to systems. We know that we're living in challenging times, and that guardianship is often sought in hopes that it will manage behaviors or manage destructive family systems or address scarce resource problems. But we have to recognize at the same time that some of those really complicated problems really aren't even going to be solved by guardianship. So we want to be careful that we aren't using guardianship unless it's absolutely the only resort. So again, thinking very differently societally here in Minnesota and nationally, whether it's at DHS level, at Minnesota Department of Education, here locally, we really have changing perspectives of how we support people with disabilities and how we can do that a lot more often than we previously thought by using tools such as supported decision making, as we understand the benefits of self-determination, as we understand that everyone uses support of trusted others to make decisions sometimes. We also want to remind people that when we use supported decision making, that we aren't getting the court involved. And there's lots of reasons that having court involvement is good. Some court oversight, some protection can be appropriate and necessary in some situations, but it's also an expensive process. It can be pretty challenging to family members to have to constantly not just be the guardian of the individual and all that that entails, but also you have to report back to the court every year. You have to answer to the court if someone files an objection to some of the actions the guardian is taking. We know that with supported decision making, supporting people, helping them build skills and abilities, there's far better outcomes for the person. A lot of research to back up that people who are supported without guardianship, who still maintain that sense of I'm involved, I just need some extra help to make decisions. The research and anecdotally backs up that people are more inclined to live in the community, more inclined to be employed, less likely to be abused, more likely to report positive quality of life, less depression, more happiness. And as of August 2020, supported decision-making considerations are now required by law. So our law did just change. This is a piece from the guardianship law, and we now have a legal definition of supported decision making, which is, again, nothing exciting. It's just quite simply assistance from somebody else of the person's choosing to help them better understand the decisions they make and the consequences of potential decisions, enabling them to make the best decisions. And also it provides for the ability of the individual to say, not only do I want XYZ people to help support me, I want those same people to actually communicate on my behalf, because it's intimidating to me to talk to the court, or it's intimidating to me to talk to a lawyer or to my social service professional or a doctor or teacher. So I want someone else to voice my concerns for me, is all wrapped up in our new statutory definition. So when we think about continuing on this conversation, if we're contemplating maybe I do need guardianship for my particular situation, we want to be really careful to make sure that we can practically carry out that guardianship will even help the situation, but also statutorily that we can legally prove the need for guardianship. And the statute now guides what we have to do. And so I wanted to make sure and bring this to you, even if it feels a little legal easy. Wanted to bring the definition in. So anybody that's going to have a guardian appointed, a petition has to be brought, and the petition allege, and I think you're going to hear more about that process next week with my pal, John Kantke, my colleague at VOA. But just to introduce the subject, the petition is going to have to be prepared, and the court's going to have to be able to hear enough evidence to make a finding that the person has an impairment to the extent that they lack sufficient understanding or capacity to make decisions. But that's not all. Often people think diagnosis, IQ score, we need a guardian. Not true, not true, not true. We have to have a diagnosis, but also that there's no other way to get the person's needs met for food, clothing, shelter, medical care, safety, supervision, even if we support them with technological assistance, and even if we support them with supported decision making. So again, doesn't matter so much what a score is or a diagnosis. If we can help them, if they're trusted people in their lives that they will work with, and we'll talk more about that later, but if they're trusted people in their lives like you, parents, families, professionals, that can help them to make better decisions, that is the criteria. And then we haven't met the criteria for the appointment of a guardian. And our statute further refines. So we have to prove that there are no less restrictive alternatives. In fact, we now have to prove what alternatives have been considered or tried, why they didn't work, how long we tried them. That has to be part of the petition and court hearing now. And so the statute tries to help us out by saying, and by the way, here are some examples of less restrictive alternatives: supported decision-making, connecting a person to the community resources or the residential resources we believe they need, appointing a healthcare agent, and that the court needs to be very, very specific, not just globally a person who has this diagnosis needs a guardian, but this particular person in their set of circumstances. So there's the statutory reference for you. Now I'm providing you the definitions too, or the criteria as well, for conservatorship, which is the court-appointed decision-making authority over money and estate and assets, but I'm not spending time on it. I want you to have the information in case you need it, but most of the time, young people with disabilities, just as they're turning 18, unless they've inherited a large estate or something, most of the time they're going to have, fairly minimal wages. They have not accumulated wealth. Maybe they'll have supplemental security income. And if they can't manage and protect those, this SSI, that can be done through representative payee and doesn't need conservatorship. And in fact, conservatorship would not be granted because there's a less restrictive alternative like rep payee. So again, the money stuff doesn't come up as often, so I'm not going to spend time on it, but you have the reference to it. I'm going to pause and see, it looks like there's a question or a chat. Also, I need to wet my throat a little bit, so I'm going to pause and see if we have questions.
Yeah, feel free to type in the chat. Right now, there's just a link to the slideshow today. I don't see anything else at the moment.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, one thing I want to talk about, and I think John will talk about it next week, so we can go fairly quickly, but another brand new piece of the guardianship law that's important for parents in your situations to understand is any guardianship initiated after August of 2020 for a person who's younger than 30, unlike in the previous realm where that guardianship would have just essentially been permanent until somebody petitioned the court to terminate it or modify it, from August forward, anybody under 30 that has a guardian granted, that guardianship now is going to automatically expire in 6 years, unless the court says it'll expire even sooner. And that is intended to stop that action that has been in place since the beginning of our guardianship law to say an 18-year-old who has needs now for help with decision making is going to have the same level of need for help when they're 30, when they're 50. This is recognizing that a whole lot of young people, including those without disabilities, our brains aren't fully developed yet, are they? Until the person is 30. I'm so sorry. I have this dry cough today. 1 second.
Anita, no, that's all right. We do have one question here. It's a good segue.
Great.
Oftentimes, parents see guardianship as a way to protect vulnerable children, especially as related to finances. How is this being addressed now?
That is a perfect question, and I'm going to come back to that. So if I don't, jump in again. That's an excellent question, and we'll come to that. So the limited duration guardianship, just people need to be aware, if you are bringing a petition, your job, among other things, is to be thinking ahead. In 6 years, this guardianship will terminate. So what can we do to help figure out what are the person's deficits and how can we build in skills and abilities and plans like representative payee or budgeting or some of the things that were implied in the question. What can we do to build in support so that when that guardianship terminates, the person is ready to go without having to go back and petition to have the guardianship extended, which is also possible. So just want to make sure people understand that. So let's get a little bit more away from the theory and down into what is supported decision making. Jonathan Martinez is perhaps the best known person associated with supported decision making. He's an attorney who represented a young woman named Jenny Hatch in like 2012, 2013, 14, in that era, who was under guardianship of her parents, a young woman with developmental disabilities who really was, we can debate whether she needed the guardianship to begin with or not, but she didn't need it anymore as her life had gone on and she gained more skills and abilities and life situation had changed. So Jonathan helped her petition and it made national news. And it was the first time supported decision-making really came into the news, came into our awareness, I would say. So he defines it's quite simply a way people can make their own decisions and a way they can stay in charge. People making decisions with the support of others instead of others making decisions for them. Quite simply, again, and then they have their own definition. I used to share this definition more widely before Minnesota had its own legal definition, but I still like this one because it's in kind of more less legalese and more layperson's terminology, but it's just like we talked about earlier, or as Jonathan would say, really, it's just a fancy way of saying it's human decision making. It's how we all make decisions. If we were to conduct a poll right now and I ask you, last time you had a really complicated decision to make, did you just make it all by yourself? Or did you spend a little time maybe doing a little Google research, which can be really dangerous? Did you talk to your family who would watch you go through the impact of your decision? Did you talk to a professional who has more knowledge and have them help explain it more in language you can understand? Did you turn to friends who had similar experiences? So the idea of supported decision-making being just a way everyone, whether we have disabilities or not, at some point, depending on the complexity of the decision, we all need help making decisions. And as Jenny would say, don't need a guardian, just need some extra help. I really like this graphic too. This takes what I've been talking about and breaks it down into several areas. We have provided you with this handout. This is also a great tool to share with other family members or other professionals who hear you talking about it and you suddenly, if you're ever like me, suddenly feel a little, oh, do I really understand this enough to explain it to someone else? So this tool is great to have handy and share with people. And I just want to, I'm not going to go through every one of the sections and read it all to you because you're fully capable of doing that. But just like the breakdown, I want to call your attention to it. Key point here on this slide, it's a way to preserve people's rights and build on their existing capacity instead of jumping off from the deficits and that approach. It's just that way to empower and and remind us of the importance of skill building, just that transformative approach to assisting people. Because too often right now in guardianship, not always, not across the board, there are some fantastic, fabulous guardianship arrangements where guardians are absolutely working with the individual on teaching them and trying to help the person gain more life skills and abilities and building in supportive plans. But too often, that's not what happens. Too often we figure we're under guardianship, we're good to go. We often forget that people with disabilities are still capable of learning in many areas, in all areas, no areas, depending on the person. And we tend to have very low expectations, therefore, and bias towards that use of guardianship. So it's about thinking differently, as I've tried to do already today a little bit here, thinking differently about how do we all become good decision makers by getting a chance to make the decision, by having people help us understand the components of a decision, the skills we need. If I say I want to move out of my parents' home when I'm 19 and live in an apartment, I can't just do that. I probably don't just automatically know how to do that. I might think I do from watching TV or seeing my older siblings, but I don't just know how to do it. So what can people do to help me understand the components of that decision? How can people help me tour places? How can people, and sometimes depending on the decision, how can I be allowed to make a decision as long as it's not completely life-threatening? How can I be allowed to make a decision and fail and then learn from that mistake? Because you know what? That's how I've learned a lot. That's how I've developed a lot of my skills and abilities, is I've made some mistakes in my life and learned from them. So it's helping us, this graphic, and I forgot to give credit, Quality Trust out of Washington, D.C., and host of the National Resource Center and Supported Decision Making was the group who put this graphic together. And so what they're really trying to help us all do is better understand these concepts and understand that it's about working with the person. It's about no two people are exactly alike. So there's no one solution, no one size fits all. We're flexible, we're creative, we try different ways if one way doesn't work. We acknowledge above all that decision making is a basic human right, and it's what makes us human, is that ability to make decisions in areas of our lives that are important to us. And we should expect people to be able to make decisions even if they need help, instead of expecting people can't and then turning to the courts to, in essence, what we're doing when we're turning to the courts with guardianship is we're asking the court to remove some of those very basic constitutional rights of an individual and hand them to someone else. So thinking differently in the importance of maintaining involvement in one's own life. So again, what can we all do, whether we're professionals, whether we're families, really think differently about how we weigh the risk of harm and failure, how we weigh the benefits of guardianship with the harms that can come with it. People can become more resistive, less likely to cooperate, more angry, have more of what we too often label as behaviors, for a person who feels like all of their agency or their humanity or their human dignity has been taken away within guardianship. So when we recognize the negative impacts that can come with guardianship, it can open our eyes to the options and the promises and the benefits of supporting people, working with them instead of making decisions for them. So a lot of times when people hear this kind of conversation, especially if it's among the first few times you're hearing it, some responses are, this is scary, I don't like it, leave me alone. Other responses are, oh, I'm already doing that, I hadn't realized it. And when we think about we're already doing it, that helps us give more creativity to when a kid, before a person's 18, we're already doing some of these things, helps us recognize opportunities. Oh, we can keep doing these after the person turns 18. We don't have to automatically go to guardianship. And so the question earlier, well, what do we do about being worried about helping a young person like not get taken advantage of with their earnings or their SSI or other money they happen to have? Well, anytime we're working with them, if we just say you can't do it, you're going to make a mistake, you're going to lose your money, you made a mistake once, we have to take over for you. Again, that's not supported decision making. But if we're helping the person understand, gosh, you want to manage your SSI or you want to manage your earnings from your job, But remember a few months ago when your best friend, or who you thought was your best friend, asked you to buy lunch for the whole team, and you did that, and then you didn't have any money for the rest of the month, so you couldn't go to that movie, or I had to lend you money. Helping a person understand the ramifications of a choice they're going to make, or if they can't do it all by themselves, they're still being taken advantage of, or even exploited, or theft, right? If they absolutely can't manage it by themselves, how can we build in ways? All right, I will become the representative payee for your benefit, but then we're going to sit down together and budget together. And then when we've paid the necessary bills or co-pays or whatever comes up, then the rest of the money you can have for the rest of the month. But let's maybe think about giving it to you in smaller portions to help you track it for the rest. So anytime we're doing anything like that, supporting the person, but not doing it for them, they're involved in the conversation, they're involved in the carrying out the tasks. That's an example of supported decision-making with regard to managing money. Same thing. Anytime you're already doing it. I mean, as a parent of a person under 18, you're their de facto legal guardian. And so you're making their medical appointments for them. You're attending you're making medical decisions for them. But I bet you're not just talking to the doctor and hearing a diagnosis and then just making a decision without talking to your kid. You're still needing their cooperation to actually take the medicine, to actually comply with that diet, whatever that decision might be. It's the same thing with adults. You can still be very involved, attending appointments with the kid, explaining the choices in language that the person can understand instead of the medical jargon. Anytime you're involving the person, healthcare, money management, deciding where to live, these are all great examples of how you're probably already developing skills in supporting the person you care about or other people in your life with supported decision making. We know not everybody is a candidate for supported decision making versus guardianship, but a whole lot of people are. Anytime we're working with a person as they're approaching 18, and by the way, I hope we're not, I didn't say this very well earlier, let's not wait till they're 17 or 17 and a half to be thinking about this, right? Because then we haven't spent the time thinking ahead of creative approaches. How can we build on the months or even years if we're at 14, 15, 16 years old and start thinking ahead? Age of majority is coming up, that 18th birthday is coming up. What are areas of skills and problems that we still need to address and work on? So anytime, if we've got the person who, your young person turning 18, who can acknowledge, yeah, I do mess up with my medications. I do mess up by giving all my money away to friends, and then I regret it and realize they're not really my friends if all they want is money from me. I want that kind of help. I do have people in my life that can help me. I am open to hearing. I may not like it and I may resist at first, but ultimately I'm open to hearing what other people what you, parent, teacher, can share with me about how my decision might not meet my life goals, right? And then ideally, we would also want people to complete a healthcare directive if they have finances, a power of attorney, so that should the situation arise down the road where they truly can't be involved at all in decision makings, then we do have a legal healthcare decision maker in the healthcare directive and a legal decision maker and a power of attorney if there's money to manage. But again, some people, we just are not going to be able to overcome that resistance, or at least we won't be for a while. And maybe when they're a little older and their brain keeps maturing more. So initially, they're so resistive, they're so unable to see that they have any disabilities, any challenges, any vulnerabilities. Maybe we have to seek guardianship initially and give more time to build those trusted relationships for the person's capacities, continue the intellectual growth that may still be possible, depending on the person. So some people still are going to need guardians forever. Some people are still going to need guardians temporarily, but a lot of people probably don't need them at all where we had previously thought they did. So we know there's a lot of misperceptions out there. In fact, our office has published several myths and fact sheets about guardianship, one of which is people truly have believed that whether it's parents or the student or special ed professionals, unfortunately, have historically truly believed we're required by law to get a guardian when they turn 18 because they have a disability. Some care providers truly believe we have to get a guardian for a person with a disability or they can't come and live in our community-based residential facility. So those are myths, those are wrong, that there's nothing in our laws federally or local or statewide or in our policies through Department of Health or Department of Human Services that says people with disabilities have to have guardians. I'm going to pause and see about questions that we should talk about before I go further.
Yeah, we have a couple questions.
Hey.
So the first one, at what age do you think it is good to start the process of being our child's guardian? We just became guardians of our son at 27 years old. We wish we would have done it sooner as we had complications in healthcare decisions. Now we have a 14-year-old. What age should we possibly start that process with her?
Okay. So John's going to talk a little bit more about that next week too. You absolutely cannot start the official legal process to get a guardian in place until a person with a disability is, I don't remember, I think it's like 17 and a half, but it goes into effect at their 18th birthday. That's the legal adulthood. So that's the actual legal process. The thought process for your 14-year-old is now, as we start thinking now, if you are beginning to think we can't support her well unless we have the legal authority, I want to invite you to take a couple steps back and think, all right, why are we saying that? What are the issues? What is not going well with her? And I have a few tools that we're going to get to help you think through that process. But think about what's not going well. And instead of then automatically saying, so we need a guardian for that, let's think about what's not going well. And we have 3-4 years here to think about, how can we modify that problem? How can we either bring her more skills to her? How can we think about hiring services that would support that deficit? So try to start with how can we not do guardianship in the next 4 years we have. And then as we're approaching getting closer to the 18th birthday and we still can't figure out a way to not do guardianship, then the time is, 17 and a half to start talking to an attorney about that. I'm also giving you a resource at the end. Our office has a statewide guardianship information line for you, your kid, individuals, families, professionals of all ilk throughout Minnesota can call and we'll do an individualized consultation with you about your situation too. So, other questions?
We currently have guardianship and custody of our granddaughter through the courts. Does this expire when she's 18, when she'll be a senior in high school?
Correct. I'm not a lawyer and I'm definitely not a family lawyer because this falls into family law when we're talking about guardianship and custody of minors. And the question may or may not be a little different if your granddaughter has a disability. But just generally speaking, those guardianships of minors because of custody issues, yep, those expire generally speaking at 18. And again, you'd want to talk to your lawyer about your particular situation.
That's all the questions right now, Anita.
Okay, let's keep going then. So again, when we think about guardianship, we want to think about, as you'll hear next week when you talk with John, the process can be overwhelming. For some people, it's not so much overwhelming, but there is some hassle associated with it. There is some harm that comes to the individual with it, that decreased sense of self, that loss of agency, the studies I referenced earlier that back up some of the harms of guardianship. And what we know is when people are working together, when they feel like I get to be the captain of my own ship, I can maintain agency in my life, we sometimes call it, people are more inclined to work cooperatively with you so that they do seek you out to help with decision making and not have to have guardianship. Definitely we want to think about safety and vulnerability concerns. And I can't remember if I have this later on the slide, but I'll jump into it right now. Sometimes, again, I mentioned earlier, we think about we've got guardianship in place now, the person's super safe. And then with really good intentions, but sometimes the guardian then starts wrapping the person in bubble wrap, as I call it. They start sort of closing the person subject to guardianship or their kid, adult child. We start closing doors to opportunities because we think I've got this guardianship authority. I'm going to do everything to keep them safe and no harm can ever come. So I'm going to make sure, for example, good intentions, but they can't have a cell phone because I heard about a story where somebody got in trouble where they were exploited, and bad things happened in dating relationships, starting with cell phones or internet access, or they can't smoke. They want to smoke and I can't let them smoke because that's a health issue. We all know it's a health issue. And what else? The dating. I can't let this person have that boyfriend because something bad might happen. They might engage in a relationship and this person doesn't understand. And so we think, oh, we've got a guardian and we've got it put in place and everything's safe now. But what happens is that individual subject to guardianship is still a human being, and the guardian's decisions don't change the person's wants. The person still wants to smoke. And so what are they doing? They're sneaking cigarette butts out of a common ashtray or out of a gutter, or they still have, whether we like it or not, whether we can face it or not, people with disabilities are still human beings in human bodies and still have chronological age appropriate hormones and development and need for human connection and human intimacy. So what is it if we think somebody's not going to be safe in a dating relationship, so we say no, then they're going to sneak around and have dating relationships that we don't know about and they won't tell us. So how much safer is that, right? So we want to think really carefully when we think we're protecting a person with guardianship and the decisions of a guardian. Sometimes we're placing a person in more danger. So that's a hard thing to think about. But we want to think about that. We want to think about if we go through all the hassle of getting a guardianship, will it even resolve it? Sometimes we think about, remember I mentioned at the beginning, we think about guardianship because there's a bad relationship, maybe with a divorced, their other parent. The parents are divorced and there's a relationship with that, and we want to fix that dynamic somehow by having guardianship so that that divorced ex-partner will think can't be involved in my person's life. Or, we think about guardianship as things that's going to happen, and it really can't solve it, because the individual under guardianship has rights and has rights to visit people they want to visit, as long as it's not an imminent likelihood of serious harm. So we have to think carefully, will it even achieve what we want it to achieve? And we also want to think about, if we don't rush off and get guardianship right at 18 and we try some things and things go very badly, as it did for you, who mentioned you waited till the person was 27. And I applaud that intent. Theoretically, it's great that you tried that. And I hear the pain and trauma that you went through. So that's exactly right. We try it first, and later on, we can still seek guardianship if we have to. It's still an option, but let's not rush to it. Let's remember, so often parents get told or presume or gets hinted that you have to get guardianship because clearly your adult child with a disability won't be able to understand their medical situation. They won't be able to remember to get their prescriptions refilled, all those things I kind of hinted at earlier. None of that's necessarily true. If your adult child is comfortable and lets you set up the medical appointment, lets you go along with them and walk into the clinic setting when we ever get to do that in person again, lets you call the pharmacy, lets you go to the pharmacy and pick up the meds, maybe your adult child will have to sign a release of information. But I don't have guardianship over my husband, and I just picked up his prescription the other day, right? So there's still a lot of things we can do. We don't have to have guardianship just because the person is disabled. And I hinted earlier, what if my adult child, what if my kid's taken advantage of? Okay, how would they be taken advantage of? Do they actually even have any money to be taken advantage of by? And if they do, how can we build in protections? I gave a few examples earlier. Maybe we work with them to make sure all the bills are paid first, the have-tos are paid first, the needs are paid first, and then maybe smaller amounts of pocket money, in a way that even if a friend does constantly trick them or convince them to hand over their money, it's in smaller amounts, so it's not as great of a loss, right? But what about my kid will make bad decisions? Again, I come back to, let's think carefully about that. Sometimes we get afraid somebody's going to make a bad decision because they're saying they're going to do something that they want to do. I love to facetiously say, my kid wants to, as soon as they graduate, they told me they're going to buy a bus ticket and head off to LA and join a band. and I'm terrified, so I have to get guardianship so they don't do that. Well, some of that is some of that just your kids dreaming out loud, and that idea is going to fade away later. And by the way, they won't actually buy a bus ticket to LA because they don't have that kind of money. They can't get themselves to the bus station. So do we really have to squelch that dream that might just evolve or die out on its own versus going to get a guardianship for something that probably won't even happen, right? So, or a different kind of decision. A person might get hurt in a relationship. Again, I'm not talking about a sexual assault or physical abuse. That's a different story. But I don't want my kid to get involved in dating because they have such a tender soul because of their disability, and they could get hurt if they break up. Have you ever broken up in a relationship? And did that break your heart? And did that break the hearts of people who care about you, that saw you going through that pain and trauma? But also, would you have never wished to have that relationship? Did you learn anything about picking a more loving partner the next time, right? So we just want to remember people learn from mistakes too. And if we keep them from making decisions, we don't always help them grow and be their best and self-protective selves. So again, supported decision-making can sound new and foreign and scary, but frankly, a lot of you are already doing it. You're already using supported decision-making, even if you don't call it yet. And frankly, you who have or are working professionally with kids, with teens, I want you to think about this parallel. Not that adults with disabilities are children. Nope, not saying that. But I'm saying right now, when you work with your teens, be they students or your own kids, you already are facing a young person who can be pretty, with or without a disability, who can be pretty stubborn, pretty, I know what's best for me, get out of my face, teacher, get out of my face, mom or dad. While you have legal authority over that kid, do you actually just assert your legal authority and stop them from doing something or get them to do something just because you said so? Usually not. What are you usually doing? You're working and having conversations and working with them and bargaining and showing them the error of their ways. And if you do this, then that'll happen. You're already using supported decision-making with people before they're 18. I would argue it's a lot of continuing to do that same thing, and just don't get caught up in that misperception that you must go get legal decision-making authority. Remember, as Jenny says, I don't need a guardian, I just need some help. And time again, that's what we find, and we can have open conversations at 14. Start having those conversations about what areas, child, what area, young adult, teenager, what areas do you, what scares you about being an adult? I'm going to tell you what scares me about you being an adult, and can we talk through some of these issues? And so can we work towards some plans? Questions? Yep.
No questions in the chat yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here's a couple tools I want to go through to help sort through how. Sorry about that. How do we figure this out? How do we figure out what to do, what help? How do we even begin these conversations? So there's some great tools available for you, and we've provided them in the handouts as well. But I like this one, the Supported Decision-Making Brainstorming Guide, to help you think through, as it recommends. These are just screenshots from the actual guide. So it's not pretty with graphics and things, but it just suggests go through each area of a person's life. You can start this at 14, you can start this at 17, you can start this at 23 if you haven't gone through guardianship, or if you're already in guardianship and you want to think about terminating or modifying. So brainstorm together. Is the person already making this decision all by themselves? Are they getting help? Are you doing it for them? Are there other ways you could do it to transition from for to with them? So take the example of healthcare choices. How are we right now doing it? Whether they're 14 or whether they're 23, how is it currently happening? And then what can we start doing? So could we accomplish the same things that I'm doing with you as a 14-year-old once you're 18 by having you sign a release of information that gives your doctor permission, and the pharmacy and the home social services, teachers, the ability to talk to me? So this form just gives some nice examples of thinking about different ways we can support people in the various ways. So just again, and then how are we currently, or how might we be thinking about decisions about where the person's going to live? And this should be a little familiar because I used some of these as examples of supported decision making in earlier slides. So it just does a nice job of walking through the really key areas of decision making with a person with disability. So I hope that helps answer the question that somebody asked earlier. Another tool, same kind of thing. So the previous one is really aimed speaking to you, the parent or the caregiver, or the professional. This next tool, it really speaks to the individual themselves, but obviously you can work on it together. This one has a few more fancy graphics. This is a longer tool. In fact, look at the table of contents. It's pretty, I know that's a little hard to read, but it's pretty comprehensive in laying out what is support, how do we think about choices, how do we think about building in some supports. Do we actually fill out a formal piece of paper that says to the doctor and to the special ed professional and to the social worker that I want XYZ person to be my supporter? So it really walks through that. And just to give you a couple more examples, you can see, again, the language is aimed at the person. Again, you can start working on these workbooks at 14. You don't have to wait till 17 or 18 or 23, but applicable at any point. So really encouraging people just to think about how you're making choices now and what might that look like. So it encourages people to just start thinking about a particular choice, and then think about, write down what it is that is worrying you about that choice. What are the impacts of the choices? If it's one you already made, how did you do it? Did you do it all by yourself? Someone helped you, someone did it for you? And then how did that feel? What went well, what didn't go well? So it just talks through, it helps really both you as a parent or a professional caregiver and the young person really think about different life stages and or different areas of decision and what went well and what tells us, gosh, I think we need more work on this. I think we need to build more skills and so forth. I love this chapter because I think it really gets the brain juices flowing of thinking about ways we can support people. So it just lists, and again, I'm not going to spend time reading it to you. You can read it yourself later or access the actual tool. But I just think it's so great to point out different ways that maybe we hadn't even thought of ways that we can help support people and help them better understand the decisions they have to make and how to make better decisions. And a great reminder for all of us, like just how many resources are out there that we can build in that we didn't have even 20 years ago, like our smartphones. Sometimes we think of those as a scary tool of the trouble somebody can get into with having access to the internet right there in their hands, but also think about how much independence it can promote. We can build in timers to take your meds. You can use Google Maps or whatever map option to help people not get lost or to find the next bus or to call home if there's a problem. So there's a lot of built-in protections, even as we sometimes fear that access to cell phones are dangerous for people with disabilities. This is another great tool, and there's 3 of these tools that I know of that are built around the same model of sort of this stoplight, this idea that, again, go through areas of decision making, whether it's daily life and employment, healthy living, as shown in this Missouri stoplight tool, safety and security. I know it's kind of blurry, so I've given you the actual form. This is one model. There's also the ACLU has taken a similar approach to these columns of green or totally independent, making the decision all by myself. So everything's going great there. We don't need to worry about it. The middle column or the yellow column being, I need some extra help, or the final right column being, I can't do this at all. Some people take that to mean if I've got check marks in that far column, that means I have to get guardianship for those areas. But I would say maybe, but first it means those are some areas that are opportunities for more skill building. And I know before we officially started today, we were chatting a little bit about the Charting the Life course tool and curriculum. Same thing, they took that same tool. Actually, I don't know who did it first, but they use another version of that approach to think through, can I do this by myself? Do I do it with help? Or can someone else help me? So we're getting close to the end. I just wanted to round it up with my little bicycle metaphor to help us think about supported decision making. And I stole this metaphor from the American Bar Association last year. They published a great article on people with disabilities and do they have the capacity to vote? And a lot of times people think somebody with an intellectual disability or other disability can't vote because they don't understand the issues. And this article that I stole from, but I'm giving them credit, took that notion and talked about capacity to vote is like the capacity to ride a bicycle, which can be determined accurately only by allowing the person to mount a bike and start pedaling. If capacity is lacking, they won't pedal. Therefore, then we know they can't vote, right? But I take that I take that metaphor and extend it further into supported decision making. And we want to think about, we just can't expect a person who has never made the particular decision, and in our metaphor, got in a bike and start riding. Few people could just hop on and start pedaling, right? We need to first have a functioning bicycle or functioning understanding of what the decision is. So we need to provide the necessary tools and get it up and running. A person who doesn't know how to balance well might start with training wheels or a balance bike before graduating to a regular bicycle. If they can graduate to a regular bicycle, they might still need somebody running beside them, making decisions or balancing, holding the back of that seat along with them till they can take off on their own. Or some people will never be able to do that. And so we supply them with a tricycle. We supply them with the supports they need to accommodate their deficits, and then they're bicycling, right? Even if they're using a tricycle, we can call it, yep, they know how to ride a bike. It's a different kind of bike than we might have thought of, and they need some extra support. So the idea being that that same thing with other kinds of decisions, just because someone needs extra support to do the thing doesn't mean they can't do the thing at all. Doesn't mean they have to have a guardian. So as we're preparing, as we're pulling up and getting more questions for me or comments, I just want to make sure you know, again, about the guardianship information line, families, professionals, individuals, free, great resource throughout Minnesota. The contact information is here. A couple other quick things, and then we'll do comments, just more about our program, more about our team, but I want to call people's attention to a brand new service. Thank you to Minnesota Department of Human Services grant. We have on the first Wednesday of the month from noon to 2, people can register, and then they can just show up in our virtual clinic. We send them a link to our the meeting, and people can just show up and meet with a social worker and attorney, just attorney, and get their questions answered. So individualized consultation in addition to the guardianship information phone line. Lots of educational resources on our Facebook page, so please like us and follow us there. And then again, the rest of the slides are resources. Oh, I want to make sure you know about, we published this guide available for free download. You can share it, share the link, you can print it and share it with other people. If someone would benefit from this guide but doesn't have access to the internet or a printer, reach out and we can send some hard copies. So lots and lots of resources there for you. I'm going to go back and land on our phone number just so people have that. Actually, I'm going to leave it up for a moment and then I'm going to take us off screen share and so we can talk and questions, and I can stay late because I know we are running close to end.